Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. There are a number of factors that contribute towards a student's academic achievements. One aspect that often isn't included as much in this discussion is the correlation between a student's performance and the parent's involvement in the child's education. It becomes an even more complicated discussion when we talk about how parents who themselves were unable to gain education can better help their children. On today's show, we try to explore this topic in greater detail. Joining us for this conversation is Ms. Bela Raza Jamil, who's the CEO of Idara-e-Talim-o Agahi, the Center for Education and Consciousness. She is also a public policy specialist, and she joins us from Lahore. Thank you so much, Ms. Bela Jamil, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, let's just dive right into it. In your experience and in your work, how much does a parent's involvement in a child's education really impact the outcome?
We know that in every society, parents' engagement with children is absolutely one of the fundamental pillars of their education, as well as what we call tarbiyat. And that's the shaping of the child and the child's all developmental milestones. And that happens even when the child is very young and when the parents are not even educated. We know mother's role is a very important role. However, given Pakistan's situation and given the vulnerability of households and given the fact that our organization is mainly engaged with bottom of the pyramid groups, the vulnerability of the parents and traditionally the distance of parents between homes and schools has meant that parents have been very bewildered as to what their role is going to be in connecting children with their learning. And yet they have been extremely flabbergasted about the worry that the children will lose a year, academic year, what will happen to their education, what will happen to their future. It's just not been easy. However, on a more optimistic note, what has been quite incredible, and that is our experience, in more than 400 communities across Pakistan where we worked, we managed to not just mobilize parents, but where the parents were not literate, mobilize community activists who became the bridge between the parent and the child, and between the child and learning. And that's where we found that suddenly the relationship of the parents or the home and the school, which was quite broken and fragmented, has somehow come together where the child is again reconnected with learning, but also we've seen a lot of interest by parents in their children's education. And that's where the intermediaries and activists from the local communities have come in to help. I call this a new cadre of learning, a cadre which is almost pushing forward its own learning, be it the child, be it the parent, or be it a community activist. Because without this kind of a relationship, or this triad, as I call it, in the local areas, it would have been impossible for children to continue their learning even when they were being provided by learning prompts and stimulation and learning materials. And even where the government's amazing tele-school has reached out across the country, it still meant someone had to help the children negotiate what they were watching and how do they learn what they're watching and bring it down to their own lives. Parents also needed some kind of a role to support them through these new learning devices or new ways of learning in the new normal.
Right. Ms. Jamila, you give us such an insightful answer there, and there's so much to pick out of that answer and that insight that you give us. But one thing that I do want to talk about is your experience in which you talk about how intermediaries and activists have bridged the role between parents and children. How did they exactly do that? And when we say bridging, what was initially missing that then became a part of a whole picture and became a solution?
So you often have heard a conversation or a comment by teachers that, what do these parents know? they hardly know anything. How can they help their children? So in the normal times, parents were sort of just pushed away because of the fact that teachers felt that really parents are not playing a part. And so there was a huge communication divide between the parents and the teachers. And so when the child came to school or was not understanding, as you know, our children's learning outcome levels are very poor. So the teachers would put the blame on the parents, and the parents would often say the teachers are not giving the attention in an overcrowded classroom. Now, come COVID and this pandemic, it meant that everything has completely had to be reshaped and redrawn. And in that case, as the parents found that now they have to be the mainstay for their child, or at least the warrior for the child, in many cases, the parents cannot possibly follow even what is coming on the teleschool, even though it is so child-friendly, but still many of them are not literate enough. Many of them don't know really how the learning sequence work. So looking for these community activists was one of our biggest strategies. Let's look for people who are in the neighborhoods, who can be found either with a Android, so that WhatsApp messages can be given or SMSs can be sent to them. But we had to find these people to come help in bridging that gap between the parent and the child, and the parent and the learning system. So we set up, for example, in some places, these places called Sanjavera. These are community spaces where an activist or an intermediary comes to help the child. The parent often comes with the child. There could be 6 to 8 children in socially distant spaces. And then they're given some kind of learning prompts, stimulation to learn numeracy or language or science or anything from early years all the way to grade 5. But that's where parents became fascinated because this is a very new way of learning. This is a new way. Now they're not asking complicated. They're saying, how many blue things do you have in the house? Can you make with your lentils or dals, your ABCs? Can you write words through all of that? So the whole methodology of learning has taken a new turn. Instead of becoming very classically and distantly pedagogic, we've become very contextualized in terms of the local level of wisdom and local level of materials that could be available in the community. And parents have found, I can do that. They're asking for different shapes or circles around the house or in a room or in a kitchen or whatever it is. So I think we have had to repurpose the content in a way that it is much more accessible for parents to understand and for them to feel, I know I can tell a story and now my child can actually answer those questions because I know what questions I'm asking in a story. Who was your favorite character? Who do you think, was a good person in the story? Who do you think was a superhero in the story? So it's all of those things, but it meant that we had to work with parents quite closely. Our schools normally do not. So
Right. Ms. Bela Raza Jamil, thank you so much for your insight there. What you've told us about your experience and how this gap between the parents and the children and the learning system has been bridged, the various ways it can be bridged. You give us a very thorough example of that. Thank you so much for taking out the time and joining us. Now we're joined by Professor Ujjwal K. Chaudhary, who's the Pro Vice Chancellor of Admas University. He joins us from Kolkata. Thank you so much, Professor Chaudhary, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, as we talk to Ms. Bela Raza Jamil of what the situation is like here in Pakistan, the various innovative ways in which activists and educational specialists have been working to bridge the gaps, it's really prompted a question which comes to how important it is to empower parents, not just in terms of knowledge, but making them feel like they're important components in the entire learning system, especially parents who belong to low-income backgrounds. How do you see this?
Okay, the question that you have asked about parents, I am in university education. So at the university level, yes, there are many parents who are also from middle to lower middle class background of our students, and they initially had troubles. They could not understand that an education through a mobile or through a laptop can be equally significant or important as a face-to-face education. So we really had to do a parent-teacher, or rather an interactive session with our learners and parents together. The first few sessions we had to do with them. That the child or the learner is spending a lot of time on mobile doesn't mean that he or she is wasting time. That itself, that realization itself had to be given. Second, we had to do a lot of advocacy in a way with some parents that here, the way we have clothes, shoes and all while we go out, similarly, laptop and mobile and internet connections are becoming the minimum gear or the minimum necessity with which you can continue your education going ahead. So this had to also be, and this not just for the short term, because we are not going back to January 2020 situation anymore. So it was for the long term as well. So therefore, there has to be a blended education sensitization, and we had to bring the parents to do that. Several sessions were conducted for them as well. That's one point. The other point that I would like to note here on the parent side is that the environment at home sometimes may not be conducive to digital learning, especially homes where the space is limited, where the homes are in busy, congested areas. So that sensitization also had to be done, that you have to give sort of a situation to your learners where by which they can actually participate in education properly, and there has to be an environment of peace, environment of less noise, if not no noise, and backgrounds and all taken clear, sanitation, cleanliness. So these also, because many times the learners had to come online on video as well. So this was the second part. The third part, that online education, online tasks, online creative expressions, online examination, these are also necessary part of education. This also sensitization had to be given to our parents. But because I'm in the private university, most of our students come from middle to upper middle class. There are few from lower middle class, and they also have scholarships here. So therefore, the problem wasn't so much with the parents who were already educated or coming from a different class, where they understood to an extent the significance of online education.
Right. As you mentioned, your university deals with a certain segment of society, but you do reach out to students that come from more humble backgrounds in this regard. And I think that's where we should try to dig into this entire idea of teacher and parent engagement a little more. For many families, having laptops, having internet, having enough space is a privilege. Many families don't have that. In this regard, how can universities, how can governments support those families, especially when we see how important that is during a turbulent time such as this one?
First of all, a class-divided society, economically divided society, is bound to have a digitally divided society as well. And with disparity between urban and rural infrastructure, the digital divide becomes even more acute. So class division or economic division disparity is already creating digital divide, and the urban and rural disparity is further worsening the situation. So that's there, and there's no doubt about that. What you are saying is perfectly right for India as much as it might be right for Pakistan as well. But having said that, in my opinion, the way roti, kapda, swasth, siksha or makan, these are 5 important ingredients for a dignified life. Going ahead, the 6th ingredient will be digital access. We would need digital access almost going ahead as we would need food, house and clothing and all that. So therefore, the government has to take. Now, for example, I would look forward to the government spending minimum of 6% of GDP or annual budget for education. I'm happy. Usually it was 2.5% till now. Only 3 or 4 days ago, new education policy has been declared by the government of India, and 6% has been promised from the next budget. I'm looking forward to that. This additional money should actually go for creating digital infrastructure. So digital India should be a reality and not just a slogan through this investment going ahead. Point 1. Point 2, there is a law in India that 2% of profits of every company which is in profit-making situation has to be given for corporate social responsibility, which is like contributing to the social good, social welfare. So I'm looking forward to corporates contributing to digital access of the people at the grassroots level. As you are saying, and very rightly saying, hinterland has a lot of access problem on digital. So access and quality, both of digital access and digital quality of the access, both have to increase, and the corporate can give their CSR 2% for the next 1 to 2 years completely for creating and helping create digital access. And universities like us, which are luckier to have a bit of resources, where we have certain days which are off. For example, we do not use our physical resources on Saturdays and Sundays. That is a time that we can also help the nearby vicinity, the government schools and colleges, where largely the lower sections, in the sense lower middle class and poorer sections of the, or economically disadvantaged sections, their children study.
Right.
We can give our infrastructure for our corporate social responsibility as well. These are 3 or 4 things. And I would expect the telecom companies to also spend, or rather come with policy. For example, the students have lower or concession in train and buses. There should be concession in data pack, net package as well from the telecom companies. New packages for students, bona fide students, and maybe even teachers can be thought of. These are some suggestions to bridge the digital divide, which is a glaring reality for South Asia.
Definitely. The digital divide has become a glaring issue, one that has been uncovered more and more by and due to this pandemic. And as you say, these are various ways in which institutions and various stakeholders in societies can move forward to try to cover that digital divide. Now, one thing I do want to talk about, as you mentioned, there exist various divides along class lines. There's also an issue of an inaccess to equal opportunities, often because of there not being a uniform standard of education, some that vary considerably between private institutions and public institutions. In this regard, you mentioned something in which you talked about how private institutions can help public institutions during this time to uncover and try to close the digital divide. In terms of learning, in terms of content, in terms of knowledge, how do you think that divide can be gapped, and how do you think private institutions such as yours can help with that?
I appreciate. This is a very good question. There is a very good perspective that you are bringing forth. So we are now creating proprietary content and aggregated content. For example, the subject is, let's say, atomic theory. So proprietary content is a video of the teacher himself, the mentor. I do not want to use the word teacher. We are moving from a teacher-student scenario to a mentor-learner scenario. And that's a qualitatively different perspective. But having said that and not going deep into it, let me say that the proprietary content is the content of the mentor through his video, through his PowerPoints, through his case study. An aggregated content learning resource is the learning resource which is available free, open source learning resource. So both aggregated and open source can be clubbed together, and a part of it, or full sometimes, can be shared with less privileged youngsters in other institutions. And there could be also joint conferences, joint seminars online. That's another way of reaching out. We are also in the process of preparing short videos, 5 to 6 minutes videos on various subjects with an element of inspiration or motivation put in along with the subject matter. So when we're talking of, let's say, economies of large scale, we are also adding a bit of learning motivational aspect and examples.
Right. Professor Chaudhary, sorry to interfere, but as you mentioned this, I do want to ask one last question. Now, the reason we talk about intellectual and information-based gatekeeping is because it allows a business model to operate, a business model for which many private institutions get their funds from, and then they reinvest, and that's how they operate better than public institutions. How committed do private institutions, not just in India but all over South Asia, need to be in order to overcome this gatekeeping of information for society's greater good?
If I'm being paid fees by X number of students and I'm doing justice to them through advanced learning resources, better technologies, and better faculty members, I am doing justice to my work. Because those who have paid for my education are my first client, first a member of the family, and I must take care of their interest. This is true for every business and every initiative, whether they're business or not. Having said that, what can I do with my resources further? What can I do further to reach out to a larger audience? And there I would like to suggest some hours or a day, a week, and some part of our learning resources, some sessions by our faculty, special sessions, can be and should be shared as our corporate social responsibility, institutional social responsibility with larger audiences around. But as an institute which is not funded by the government, but funded by my 5,000 students, my first commitment is and shall remain to my 5,000 students who are paying for it.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Professor Ujjwal K. Chaudhary, for joining us from Calcutta, taking out the time to talk to us. It was a pleasure having your very interesting insight into this conversation. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, we discuss how deeply the climate crisis interlinks with issues of poverty and income inequality. Stay with us. Welcome back. Now, experts continue to warn how the climate crisis will disproportionately impact the most vulnerable. This means that the poor and marginalized communities will be the worst victims of a crisis which has been largely driven by the big economic players. But in order to fully understand why those who fall at the lowest end of the income spectrum will suffer the most, it's important to understand the link between climate change and poverty. That's our discussion for today. Joining us for this conversation is Mr. Gilbert Van Kerkhove, who's the author of the book Toxic Capitalism. He joins us from Beijing. Also joining us today is Mr. Umair Ahmed, the South Asian editor of the Third Pole, which reports on issues in the Himalayan region. He joins us from Delhi. Thank you both for joining us, and welcome to the show. Gilbert, I'd like to begin with you, and let's begin with a question that sets the foundation for our conversation later on, which is how deeply is climate change and the climate crisis we see today linked with poverty?
Several links. We can see actually two different links. One link is why we are coming to climate change. Climate change obviously is also linked to pollution issues and related. When in my book, I talk a lot about income inequality indeed, because there is a very strong link between income inequality and bad consumers. Bad consumers because they don't have enough money. They buy, I would say, rubbish, if we can call it like this. So there's a lot of waste, and there is a lot of waste of energy on all sides. So this income inequality contributes already to climate change and pollution. On the other hand, income inequality is also a very heavy burden for those who suffer from low income once we do have climate change. Climate change can come under different forms. We can have flooding, coastal flooding. This affects mostly poorer people who have no way to fight against it. So it's a very big issue. Or it can be high temperatures or climate change, cold or hot. Again, the people who have less money, they will suffer the most at first, while people who have enough financial resources, they will be able to cope better with either flooding, going to higher grounds, buying better houses, better locations, fighting the heat with air conditioning, and so on. So income inequality, I would say, yes, is a very important aspect of the bad things affecting today our society.
Right. Gilbert, now, I know you deal with these issues on a regular basis. That's why they come so easy to you. But when we try to translate what you've talked about to the common viewer, poverty and income inequality are seen as being two very separate things. The World Bank keeps reiterating, at least before and prior to this pandemic, that poverty is on the decline, but income inequality, as various organizations state, is on the rise. How do those two things work separately to impact this issue of climate change we're talking about?
Well, if we talk about income inequality, I think most of the people immediately think about the people who are paid less than they should be. It's also due to the structure of our society. As explained in my book, the people are paid not enough for the work they do render, to manufacture things, to do agriculture, and so on. So it's an unfair type of payment that results in income inequality. People should deserve better wages. Because of this, they, of course, spend in a different way. It's very interesting, if I may say so. If you look at poor people, generally speaking, are overweight. So you can say, if they are so poor, why are they so fat? This is because they eat badly. Also, they buy things of very low quality that contributes a lot to waste in resources and everything. So income inequality, I would say, really it has to do with poverty. And with the COVID-19 virus, this has been even exacerbated because you see that the first people to get the brunt of the problems, because they have no more job, they have no more income, they have no more savings, they are the first to suffer from the virus.
Right. Gilbert, stay with me on that point. I also want to introduce another guest who's just joined us, Mr. João Meto, who's a senior researcher at the Brazilian Institute of Space Research and head of the Earth Systems Science Center. He's also the appointed IPCC contributor. He joins us from Brazil. Thank you for joining us, João, and welcome to the show. But before I get to you, I'm going to jump to Omer. Omer, in 2019, a United Nations expert, human rights expert, claimed that the climate crisis is going to cause an apartheid of sorts. How much of that are we seeing right now, especially in South Asia?
Well, okay, so you see where the disasters are hit and where they're located. And you'll find that, now look at the monsoon flooding throughout South Asia. The people most affected are the poor people living by riversides in urban areas where they have no recourse. Similarly, if you look at if you look at sea rise across South Asia, it's the poor fishing communities along the sea lines that are the most affected, whose lands are being taken over. And these are fishing communities, and right behind them, farmer communities. Added to that, the areas that are heating up very fast, higher than the global average, are in the Himalayan region. And these communities, and there are 250 million people that live in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, across from Afghanistan all the way to Burma's border. These people these communities earn on the average a lot less than the national average in each of the 8 countries that they border. All of them are being impacted the most by climate change. These are also the communities that have the least input in how national strategies are formed. So if you look at how the lockdown, the COVID lockdown affected communities across South Asia, this is the poor labor class, the class that has the least ability to influence national policies, right, and also, therefore, international policies. And they are the ones who are the ones left out of jobs.
Right, that's a very, very important point that you make there. And I'm going to take this to João and talk to him about this. João, does that resonate with you as well? Talking to us from Brazil, a country that is very, very important when it comes to the environment because of the Amazon forest there and because of how we've been seeing President Bolsonaro deal with climate change. Do you feel like it is the vulnerable population that's being left out the most when it comes to policymaking?
Yes, definitely. So this is it's a common situation in this part of the world as well. So if we see the increase of the population in the past 200 years or 100 years or so, the amount of the resource needed and the amount of the demand over the land and over the resource are increasing exponentially, and this is exacerbating the inequality as well. So as you mentioned, Brazil has indeed a very important environmental situation in terms of having a huge tropical forest, which is under threat because, in fact, people are looking to a very urgent way of dealing with that instead of thinking on a long term. And so the question on inequality has been exacerbating as well. I heard the previous person talking about the COVID, which is also leading to increasing the threat under the less favored population. And these less favored populations are the one that has less actions on the policy on the ground and demands more. So this is indeed a global problem. It has a local issues, has local different impacts or risk of impacts, but it's a global situation.
Right. One question that I put to you and Umair as well is, when we talk about these vulnerable and marginalized communities being impacted the most, the conversation and the narrative often seems to isolate the impact, that it's just them who are going to suffer. And of course, that's our conversation. They're going to be disproportionately suffering the most. But their suffering does have ripple effects on the economy, does have ripple effects on society at large. Take us through what happens in Brazil when marginalized communities, especially indigenous communities, have been marginalized, have been isolated from the policy-making scheme of things. How does that impact society at large?
You know, that's a really, really good point, Meshal. In fact, what happened, it does impact society psychologically a lot, and it does impact the way of how the country is presented in terms of dealing with the environment and dealing with its own society. One of the biggest issue is that how, we're seeing a concentration of wealth in the country in the past decades, for sure, like we're seeing in the globe in general. And so a lot of the relation that people have with the indigenous population and with the poorest people are more like, so the whole society doesn't permeate to that specific level. So we do need policies. We do need strong policies in terms of, protecting the people, in terms of engaging the whole less favored people into the main economic stream of the country, the opportunities, and that goes through good health system, good education, and good environmental protection. The people are less favored, and you mentioned indigenous people. They rely a lot on the environmental goods and ecosystem, environmental service, and that's and those sort of a connection. It is lost when we have, a strong, for instance, agriculture expansion without including those people in the system.
Right. Umair, when we talk about South Asia, we know that weather-related events, more extreme weather-related events have become more commonplace. We know that monsoon flooding, we know that rising sea levels, all of these have impacted the communities. You laid out those examples for us very clearly. Now, when we talk about the grand scheme of things, how have these communities being displaced, their livelihoods being destroyed, how has that impacted India, if we take as an example overall?
So let me give you an example of the Sundarbans region, right? And this borders India and Bangladesh. This is the world's largest mangrove forest. In the next few years, you'll have an out-migration from this area of 1.5 million people. And that's basically because as the sea levels rise, they take over farmland. And once the farmland becomes salty, you can't plant there anymore. So these are already poor people. Their only way of livelihood is their ability to farm, to grow crops. That the sea is taking away from them. There is no way to stop the sea. You can build up embankments for a little while, but that will not stop the sea. You saw the cyclones that came a month or so ago. The way that the salt water keeps coming in means that these huge areas will become more and more infertile. And these 1.5 million people will have to go somewhere simply to eat, to live. And where they will go will be slightly larger cities or the big cities. And these will be poor populations, desperate. They will themselves become easy prey for people who want to use or abuse them. And they will have limited ability to negotiate their pay. All that they will have to be able to sell is their labor. And as the big cities across South Asia are flooded by this miserable, immiserated, impoverished population, how do you think they'll react? All of this will lead to breakdowns of law and order. It will lead to harsher demands for policing, and it will lead to us seeing very miserable citizens from our countries at every corner that we turn.
Umair, what you've just laid out as an example, I think, is a perfect example of how climate change will also impact democracy, will also impact human rights, making those more and more vulnerable. Now, as we take the conversation forward, Gilbert, I want to talk about something that often comes as a rebuttal when we offer a solution to the climate change crisis, which is sustainable development. People who give rebuttals against sustainable development often state that that will leave out many people from the economic stream because it will reduce production, more people will be unemployed, and poverty will in fact increase, causing the vicious cycle of poverty to become worse. And so sustainable development really isn't the way forward. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a very good question. And in my book, I do address this issue because it is a very important issue. People say, well, if we protect too much the environment, we do too much sustainable, jobs are going to be lost. I take the opposite view, saying that, for example, if we let the people do a decent job, a good job, if we increase quality in production, manufacturing, agriculture, we pay the people a fair wage, and we also have a fair social security for them. Then, as a matter of fact, we increase the employment issues, because if you go for quality, durability, and all these things, it means you have to spend money. And yes, you will pay more for your goods, you will pay more for your consumer goods. But on the other hand, it will generate a lot of new employment. If we continue like we do now to do mass production of very poor quality, obviously jobs get lost, people get very low salaries, are paid really a pittance. As the other gentlemen were mentioning, we look at agriculture in the low-lying regions that were mentioned that are prone to flooding. This is because those people working in agriculture are being paid a pittance to generate the agricultural goods. We see this even in developed countries. Look at the USA, where they have to import poor Mexicans to do the work on the fields. Is that fair? It's like a new kind of slavery. So if we continue in this way, not to pay the right price for the goods of right quality.
Gilbert, sorry to interrupt here. Since we're short on time, I also want to get some more questions in, and I'm going to go to Jean and talk to him about this. What I talked to Gilbert about here is, of course, really befitting to what happened in Brazil in 2019, which were the forest fires, which were the Amazonian fires, and it was labeled that that was, in fact, a right of the people of Brazil in order to move towards greater economic development. How do you grapple with that narrative?
Yeah, that's a very important question, because in fact that goes along with what we think is sustainable. What are the sustainable pathway that we aim to get to? So I think when we talk about quality of life, quality of product that people have access, and the increasing demand on resources, that has to go along with the long-term availability of those resources. And that goes along with the protection of the environment. We have to look into sort of a functional, multifunctional landscape, for instance, where this goes along. So the excuse to burn forests, to expand agriculture, doesn't pay back. Because in fact, what we have to look at is to improve quality, improve soil production, soil quality for better agricultural production. We need to educate or bring technology to small farmers, so which are the ones that actually have the food on our tables. So the commodity is a very important asset, is a very important economic product from countries like Brazil. But we don't need to expand over the environment at this stage to produce enough food for Brazil and to export as well. So
right, and the long-term implications,
kind of
the long-term implications of that are very, very important to keep into consideration when we talk about economic development. Just one last question to Umair. Umair, when we talk about development as a right and how developed nations should have that right, given that everyone is ahead of them, how do you, as a climate change expert and as an environmental expert, deal with that? How should developing nations deal with that situation of whether they should get ahead, they should try to match up with more developed nations, or they should play their role in trying to move towards sustainable development?
I mean, the problem is very simple. If we want to get ahead, developing countries cannot ignore poverty. And because they have fewer resources at hand, they will take what is the quickest, dirtiest, cheapest option forward. This will only destroy our environment the most. And so it's in the interest of developing countries to look for better solutions. But it's also in the interest of the developed world, because if the developing countries pollute more over time, that will lead to huge amounts of displacement. It will lead to refugee crises. It will lead to uneven economic balances that will lead to economic catastrophes, which in the end will also impact the developed world. We have to work together, and we have to have ways in which the developed countries and the developing countries can have a mature conversation and say, look, the world is burning. We need to work together in ways that we can all find a way to live together.
Right.
That's something we've been trying for decades. And unfortunately, people are just not listening.
Right.
How that changes.
Right, Umair, I have to there, but that's such an important point that this conversation has been happening for decades and people just don't listen. But we hope that with this pandemic, developed countries realize how exactly interconnected they are, how much they depend on developing nations and vice versa, and so that there can be a mature conversation, a mature debate on how to deal with the larger crisis that's looming, which is the climate crisis. Thank you so much, Umair Ahmed, for joining us from Delhi, Jean Omedo for joining us from Brazil, and Gilbert Van Corco for joining us from Beijing. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.